This episode contains distressing themes, explicit language and descriptions of sexual violence. This podcast is intended for a mature audience. Listener caution is advised. They Walk Among Us is part of the Acast Creator Network. After almost 3 decades, one of the most heartbreaking and troubling child murders in the history of the UK has been solved. How did the investigators finally catch 6-year-old Rikki Neave's killer?
In the winter of 1994, the body of Rikki Neave was discovered in this woodland just a few hundred metres from his home here in Peterborough.
He was reported missing after playing truant from school. There are 2,500 people on the Welland Estate. Detectives hunting for Rikki's killer believe that one of them may hold key information about the murderer.
When we reviewed and reopened the case in 2015, we were committed to finding the person responsible for Rikki's untimely death and ensuring that they were brought to justice. Following an intensive and detailed investigation, with several challenges and legal obstacles, we now know what happened to Rikki on that day.
Welcome to Season 7, Episode 3 of They Walk Among Us, a podcast dedicated to UK true crime. This is a case update for Season 4, Episode 4. When the inquiry into Rikki Neave's murder was again reopened, the investigators assigned to the case began reviewing the evidence. They found that adhesive tapings taken from Rikki's clothes had been stored for over 2 decades. The tapings contained enough DNA for a profile to be cross-checked through the National DNA database. The DNA matched a man with a criminal history named James Lewis Watson. Watson's name had come up during the initial investigation, as witnesses had reported seeing him with Rikki Neave on November 28, 1994. Watson was just 13 years old at the time. He was arrested on suspicion of murder over 2 decades after Rikki's life was taken. However, he had been released on bail by April 20, 2016. In June, Watson's bail licence was revoked when he breached the conditions of his release. He did not return to the address where he had been ordered to stay in Northampton by the time of his curfew. Watson had absconded with another licensee and boarded a ferry to Europe. Once again, it seemed like obtaining justice for Rikki Neave's murder was just out of reach. That was until Watson, who was still on the run at this point, emailed his probation officer. It had been 1 month since he had fled the country. Surprisingly, Watson told them he wanted to return to the UK. When asked where he was and how they could assist him in coming back, Watson wrote, "I'm in a world of shit. I left with that Colin under the assumption that he was going to Thailand, and I could see a bit of Europe for a few days. It never turned out like that. Now I am homeless and living on the streets in Europe. I stayed in a room with some people I met, but that was not long term. Now I don't know what my next plan should be. I want to make it back for this bail, and I know I will be in trouble for my licence, but it's done now. Just picking up the pieces the best I can. I don't know how you can help me or if you can. I just need to keep in touch with you. This will all be relevant in the future." James Watson's probation officer contacted the police, who emailed Watson telling him to go to the British consulate. When he arrived in August, Watson was arrested and extradited 10 days later. despite the DNA evidence linking Watson to the clothing Rikki Neave had been wearing on the day he died. The authorities needed more proof that they had finally caught the person responsible. It was not until June 2018 that the Crown Prosecution Service determined that there was not enough evidence for them to pursue a conviction against James Watson. A joint task force made up of detectives across Hertfordshire, Bedfordshire and Cambridgeshire had spent countless hours compiling hundreds of statements in relation to the 6-year-old's murder. Head of the investigative unit, Assistant Chief Constable Paul Fullwood said at the time, "It is disappointing that following our 3-year investigation, we have not been able to identify the person or persons responsible for Rikki's murder. However, although at this stage we have no further active lines of inquiry, we remain committed to finding his killer. It is frustrating that despite 3 years of detailed investigations, we are not able to tell Rikki's family what happened on the day of his murder. But we will not give up hope to do so one day." The following year, Rikki Neave's mother Ruth and her husband Gary Rogers appealed in the Daily Star newspaper for the case to remain open. Ruth said, "When Rikki died, I died inside, and I will be dead inside for the rest of my life. But I will never give up fighting for him. I feel we are now in limbo, since the only suspect was released. There is hope, but I really do not know if it is going to happen, however much I would like it to. I'm not confident, but I hope something happens." Months later, Ruth submitted an appeal opposing the CPS decision not to file charges against James Watson under the Victims' Rights to Review scheme. The Crown Prosecution Service began to conduct the review, and on the 25th anniversary of Rikki's death, Assistant Chief Constable Fullwood said to Ruth and Gary Rogers that the police would continue to support the CPS review. They wanted to give the CPS the best opportunity to look at the case objectively, so they could make an informed decision. Speaking to reporter John Elworthy, Ruth described the hope she'd had for Rikki and the impact his death had on her life. She said, "I wanted him to have grown up and be a good lad and have given me grandchildren. When he was little, he used to get things out of skips that were broke and take them apart and put them back together and they would work. He had the brains to do anything. I could see him with a lovely girl and a few kids, and that is what really hurts. I wish he could have grown up to do the nice things in life, but that was tragically taken away from us, and that's not fair. It has had an awful effect on the family. They hate me, but it was not me who killed Rikki, so they should blame that person, not me. When Rikki died, I died. Something inside me died. It felt like having my arm ripped off. It's been a real struggle, especially at times like this, and at Christmas. For the last 25 years, it has been awful and painful and ridiculously terrible to live with. When you have something, and someone has taken that away, you never get over it, but just want to know why." Ruth Neave had gone to trial for Rikki's murder, although she was found not guilty of that crime. However, she was convicted of child abuse. In February 2020, the CPS authorised the prosecution of James Watson for Rikki Neave's murder. Watson had been apprehended under a European arrest warrant in Portugal almost 3.5 years earlier. For some time after Watson's arrest, it was speculated that issues surrounding his extradition from Portugal would impede the legal proceedings. Due to the enormity of the case file, artificial intelligence was used by Watson's defence to analyse the 10,000 plus documents in the evidence pack. Speaking about the unprecedented use of AI, Watson's barrister Sally Hobson told the Daily Mirror, "We have been served thousands of pages of evidence that we have to digest in a limited number of days. The court digital case system has massive limitations. We're not allowed to put any unused material on there. It can't read handwritten documents, and it will only throw up the exact things that you search for. The AI learns what to search for, reads and understands, and can surface in hours what would take months to find manually." The defence would have more time than they initially anticipated, because the trial was delayed from January 2021 until January 2022. When the trial began at the Old Bailey, Crown Prosecutor John Price QC told the jury that Rikki Neave was reported missing by his mother on November 28, 1994. The following day, the little boy's body was found in a wooded area close to Rikki's home, an area where he had played with friends, making dens or playing with sticks. Describing the way in which Rikki had been discovered, the prosecutor told the court, "He had been strangled. The body was naked. It was lying on the ground, flat on its back. It had been deliberately posed by the killer in a star shape, with outstretched arms and his legs placed wide apart." The pathologist on the case, Dr. Nate Carey, later testified that he had entered an area of scrubland adjacent to the road, where he saw the body of a completely naked young male lying on his back, with his arms and legs spread. The pathologist explained that a mark on the victim's neck was apparent and noted petechial hemorrhage in the eyes and face, a symptom of strangulation. The ligature mark was in a repetitive linear pattern, which Dr. Carey believed was from a zip fastener. This belief was bolstered when Rikki's jacket was found. Rigor mortis had already set in, and there was dirt on Rikki's small hands and feet. There were also scars, grazes, and minor bruises on his head. It was theorized that Rikki Neave had been strangled in a surprise attack. The killer had used Rikki's jacket as a ligature, before stripping him and disposing of his clothing in a wheelie bin 150 yards away. Rikki's shoes were found with the laces still tied, and his socks and underwear were bundled inside his jacket, with his trousers and shirt. The buttons from Rikki's shirt were missing, but one had been found on top of a leaf, close to Rikki's outstretched hand. The police had quickly zeroed in on Rikki's mother, Ruth, and she was charged with murder and child abuse in 1995. Ruth had admitted her guilt to the cruelty charges, but denied killing her son. A jury subsequently acquitted her of the murder charge, something the prosecution now admitted was the correct decision. John Price QC said that the evidence which proved Ruth had not killed her son had been apparent in 1994, but it had been misunderstood or ignored. The police focused on reported sightings of Rikki and unrelated items found in Ruth's home. Amongst Ruth's belongings, officers had come across a picture of the famous Da Vinci drawing Vitruvian Man, an image they believe mirrored the way Rikki's body had been posed. More items were seized, including a collection of true crime books and books about the occult. Testimony was also provided by the family's social worker, Deborah Lawson. Lawson said that Ruth often shouted at the children, but the social worker had not witnessed Ruth be violent toward them. However, that said, it was considered that she would not have physically abused her children in front of a social worker anyway. Deborah Lawson described how Ruth had written a manuscript about a murder story. This too was seized as evidence during the investigation. It was something the police felt strengthened the argument that Ruth had committed the killing. When she was 13 years old in 1994, Kelly Nuttall had lived next door to Rikki. She testified that his mother Ruth was a, quote, total and utter disgrace of a mother. Another neighbour told the court that he heard Ruth shouting at Rikki as they walked past his home. Alan Stacey testified, "My attention had been drawn to a young woman walking along the footpath. I heard a female voice shouting and swearing. I looked out and saw a female chasing a little boy. She was screaming, 'Fucking come back here, you little bastard. I will fucking kill you.' And he was shouting back, 'No.'" The head teacher at Rikki Neave's school also addressed the court and told the jury that Ruth Neave had called her after Rikki was found dead. Ruth threatened legal action as the faculty had not informed her Rikki was not in school the day he went missing. Jennifer Boxall said, "Ruth Neave never brought Rikki to school, ever. She was very abusive, really horrible language. He would tell me he was late because his mother was asleep on the settee, and he had to get his own breakfast. He also told me several times he had to make his own tea, the afternoon meal, as well." Rikki Neave's friend Mark Moss had spoken to the police 3 days after the 6-year-old's murder. Mark described how the friends were like brothers. Mark Moss told the police that Rikki had said he was going to run away from home because he hated school. This may explain why Rikki had absconded from school on the day he died. Testifying via video link, Rikki's friend was asked by the defence counsel if he had ever witnessed Ruth Neave taking Rikki to school. Mark Moss said he had not. He explained how Rikki would sit in the bushes upset, and upon seeing him, Mark's mother would bring him inside. Donna McCormick was 12 years old at the time of her neighbour's murder. She had given a statement to the police after Rikki's death, where she spoke about an incident she witnessed. Donna told officers, "Ruth was watching EastEnders, and Rikki kept on talking. Ruth told him to shut up, but he kept on talking. With her right thumb and index finger, Ruth grabbed Rikki around the front of his neck and pushed him up against the wall. Rikki started going blue in the face, and I began screaming at Ruth to leave him alone. Rikki fell to the floor crying. I've seen Ruth throw him across the floor and Rikki suffered carpet burns. I have seen scratches on Rikki's face, but he would not tell me how he got them. I was at Ruth's when Rikki showed me some bruises on his back. Bruises in a straight line. Rikki said that Ruth had thrown him onto the radiator. When I spoke to Ruth, she said she did throw him onto the radiator." Donna McCormick testified that she had seen Rikki's mother and her then-partner Dean Neave injecting drugs at their home. The couple had purchased the drugs from Donna's mother, which Rikki or Ruth would collect. Bryony Swift had been the family's aid worker between May and August of 1994, and again in November of that year. She had noted that Ruth was trying hard with the family and was coping reasonably well. When asked how Ruth would deal with Rikki, Bryony Swift said, "At times she would get quite cross with him. Her parenting wasn't consistent. It was a difficult situation, because Mum was not always good at parenting as she was at other times. She also hadn't had good parenting herself, so she hadn't had a lot to draw on to guide her." Swift went on to say that Ruth would make Rikki stand facing the wall or restrain him by wrapping her arms and legs around him from behind. Bryony Swift told the court, "He was quite wriggly and jiggly to start with, not liking it, but then he would start to calm down. It would last until the child submitted and apologised." Junior Prosecutor Nathan Racia asked the family's aid worker if she recalled a conversation where Ruth had described Rikki as a stumbling block in the way of getting back with her husband Dean. Swift replied, "I understood that as Rikki was in the way, really, of them getting back together, making it even more difficult. I think she probably blamed Rikki for the situation she was in a lot of ways." Throughout that November, Ruth had made statements saying that she could not cope with Rikki, was at the end of her tether, and had enough of him. The day before her son went missing, Ruth had told the family aid worker that if something was not done with Rikki, she would kill him. However, Bryony Swift said that the tension between mother and son had eased later that day, and they seemed content with one another. When the witness was asked how she reacted when she heard Ruth say she would kill her son, Swift said, "I think I was always concerned about Rikki and Ruth's relationship, and it was almost a norm in that family. But yes, of course, it concerned me. I have heard many parents say that at times of stress. All information that I recorded went to the social worker, and I would have regular phone contact and go into the office, so they were well aware of everything. But the situation calmed down later on that day, and if it hadn't, it may have had a very different outcome to what I did and didn't do. However, because it settled, it felt like those were just angry words at the time, and things were okay again." Rikki's stepfather, Dean Neave, had not been living with Ruth at the time of the murder, and he could not testify at the trial because he died in a car accident 5 years after Rikki was killed. Neave's statement from 1994 was read to the court by the prosecutor John Price, QC. In it, Dean Neave said that he and Ruth shared a fascination for black magic, but Neave's interest had waned, while Ruth was still interested in tarot cards and Ouija boards. While living with Ruth and the children for a short time between his release from prison in 1993 and their marriage being annulled, Dean Neave described how Ruth treated the children. His statement read, "She was always shouting and screaming at the children and was regularly hitting them with her hand. I thought a lot of it was unnecessary, and I could not stand it. So I moved out. I left because of the way Ruth used to treat the children." Dean Neave said that Ruth took her frustrations out on the oldest children, Rebecca and Rikki. Although Rikki was more mischievous, he always did what Dean Neave asked of him, and Neave maintained a good relationship with the children, even after the marriage ended. Dean Neave told the police that he believed Ruth was addicted to amphetamines, and her moods would shift due to drug use or withdrawal. Rikki's mother was called to testify. From the stand at the Old Bailey, Ruth said that she had been bullied into pleading guilty to the child cruelty charges at the previous trial, because she did not know what she was pleading guilty to. Ruth had always denied Rikki's murder, but spent 7 years in prison for the cruelty charges. James Watson's barrister Jennifer Dempster QC implied that Rikki had suffered the most abuse at the hands of his mother, even being locked outside in his pyjamas when he was just 3 years old. The defence contended that witnesses had seen Ruth hold Rikki by the neck, thump him, hold him upside down over a bridge, and force him up against the wall as punishment. Ruth denied the allegations, but the defence barrister spoke about something that had happened a few months before Rikki's death, when he called his mother a slag. The defence counsel said, "I suggest you grabbed him, forced him up against the wall, you pushed his head back, you forcibly opened his mouth, and you put a bottle of washing up liquid into it, and then you squeezed it." Ruth admitted that she had put a bottle of washing up liquid to her son's mouth, but claimed it was empty. Dempster asked her if Rikki had said, "I'm sorry, Mum, I love you," before he vomited. Ruth denied that her son had been sick. The defence counsel continued to outline alleged incidents between Ruth Neave and Rikki, such as a time when she wrote the word idiot on his forehead and when she threatened to kill him in front of a shopkeeper. Jennifer Dempster QC suggested that Ruth Neave was at the end of her tether with her children by November 1994, and she only loved 2 things at that time: her then husband Dean and drugs. When Ruth Neave protested that she thought she was just pleading guilty to smacking the children, the defence barrister rubbished her claims. Dempster said, "That, Miss Neave, is nonsense. The judge told you were guilty of appalling and systematic cruelty to your children, and he was right. The judge described you as wholly unfit to be a mother, and that's the truth. The judge told you that the harm you had done to your children was incalculable." Details of Ruth Neave's drug use were laid bare in court, as she was accused of using her children to collect drugs. Ruth also addressed the allegations that she was obsessed with murder and the occult-based books found in her home. The defence asked Ruth if she had held a séance to try and contact Rikki. She laughed at the accusation, but did admit to being interested in Ouija boards. The defence also asked if she described herself as being a high priestess of the occult. She denied that she had, saying there was no such thing. Ruth admitted to being interested in true crime and said that her interest neither made her evil, nor did it want to make her kill her son. After calling, quote, bullshit on many of the questions posed to her during the cross-examination, Ruth ignored a barrage of questions from the defence counsel in the following exchange. Jennifer Dempster QC asked, "Did you murder your son? Are you really not going to answer that question? Did you kill Rikki without intending to? Did you kill him accidentally? Did you move his body in a buggy? Did you have anything to do with posing Rikki's body in a star shape? Did you take his body to one of his favourite places to play? Will you not answer these questions? Miss Neave?" Ruth replied that she was treating the questions with the contempt they deserved, and asked, "At the end of the day, who's on trial? Me or your client?" Despite James Watson being on trial, much of the testimony had focused on Ruth Neave, but as the prosecution began to detail their case, they presented the jury with a picture of a very disturbed teenager.
The prosecution alleged that in November 1994, 13-year-old James Watson was exhibiting a grotesque interest in the subject of child murder generally, including things he said to his own mother. The jury were told 2 witnesses had seen Rikki and Watson together playing truant on the morning of the day he disappeared.
James Watson had been interviewed following Rikki Neave's murder. Then, aged 13, Watson admitted to seeing Rikki on the day he was killed, after witnesses reported spotting them together. Watson claimed they only spoke briefly, and he told police that he did not know Rikki. Addressing the jury, John Price QC said, "This was not true. He knew him well. It was one of the many lies James Watson is alleged to have told others about events on the Monday he had met Rikki Neave, and Rikki Neave had gone missing. He was still doing so, we submit, when questioned under caution by the police 22 years later in April 2016. James Watson had been seen with the 6-year-old on the morning of the murder, close to the scene where Rikki was believed to have been killed. Rikki was the victim of a surprise attack that left him with injuries indicating he had most likely been, quote, strangled by a method whereby the neckline of his own jacket was pulled back hard against his throat from behind. Witnesses had seen Watson and Rikki playing together, and both of them walking towards the wood. Sylvia Clary had worked as a school cleaner in 1994. She had told the police she saw Watson with Rikki Neave on the morning of November 28th. Aged 90 at the time of the trial in 2022, the witness testified via video link. Sylvia said that she was looking out of her kitchen window between 8:30 and 8:45 a.m. when she saw Rikki in his uniform and a jacket. He was not alone. She recognised James Watson as the person with him because Watson's father lived behind Sylvia's house, and he had previously done landscaping work in her garden. Sylvia Clary distinctly remembered Watson had waved at her when she saw him through the window. Evelyn Pollard also lived on the Welland Estate. She testified that she too had seen Rikki and Watson together hours later between 10:30 and 11 a.m. According to Watson, he said that he had skipped school and went to the estate where his father lived. There he met Rikki, who was supposedly watching construction vehicles on the road. Watson claimed that Rikki said, "That's a big tractor, isn't it?" And Watson responded, "That's not a tractor, it's a digger," before walking away. In the statement Watson had given shortly after the murder, he lied about the time of day he had seen Rikki. The prosecutor told the jury, he knew it had been earlier. He was indeed still with Rikki at 12:30 p.m. By then Rikki Neave was almost certainly already dead, and James Watson was still in the wood, keeping company with a child's corpse. When James Watson was questioned in 2016 about how his DNA could have transferred onto Rikki's clothes, Watson altered his version of events and was now saying that he had lifted Rikki up so he could see the digger through a hole in a fence. Andrew Bailey was 14 years older than his half-brother James Watson. Bailey testified that he had brought Watson to Rikki's house several times, as he was friends with Rikki's stepfather. Bailey told the court that he had first met Dean Neave in jail, and once on the outside they would drive around together. The defence disputed the claim that the brothers were close, and intimated that Andrew Bailey had distanced himself from his half-brother. At 11 years old, James Watson had confided to Bailey that he was gay. Andrew Bailey agreed that they had fallen out over the matter, but maintained that Watson had visited Rikki's home and did know him well. The jury heard evidence about James Watson's macabre interests, which he displayed to a number of people, including his mother. 3 days before Rikki went missing, Watson had told his mother he heard about a 2-year-old boy who had been abducted from the Parston area of Peterborough. According to Watson, the child was found naked and strangled by the dyke off Parston Parkway. A prosecutor told the court, if Watson invented such a report of child murder on Friday, the 25th of November 1994, what is one to make of the fact that only 3 days later on the Monday, such a rare and terrible thing did happen in Peterborough? A local child did go missing. He wasn't aged 2. He was 6. But this child really was murdered. This child was strangled. His body was found just off the Parston Parkway. It was by the dyke. It was naked. And this real child had been with the inventor of this bogus radio report on the day he went missing. And when they were seen together, they were about 3 minutes' walk from where his body was found. From the stand, James Watson's mother, Shirley Cliff, denied the specific conversation with her son about a murdered child ever occurred, despite being shown her statement attesting to that fact in 1995. Shirley Cliff also denied telling the police that her son did not visit her home on the day of Rikki's murder, which is what Watson had told the police he had done. At the trial, Watson's mother corroborated her son's alibi and denied lying to protect him. James Watson had been accused of indecently assaulting another child 1.5 years before Rikki's murder. The mother of a 5-year-old boy had reported her son had said someone sexually assaulted him one night before going to bed. According to the child, the perpetrator was James Watson. Reading an agreed statement of fact, the prosecutor explained that Watson had ordered the 5-year-old to touch him intimately, and Watson appeared to get aroused. Watson told the child not to tell anyone about the incident. After being informed about what happened, the boy's mother noticed her son's genitals were red, and she brought him to be examined by a doctor who noted an abrasion. Addressing the jury and recounting the opinion of the doctor, John Price QC described the injury, although the physician could not confirm whether it was caused by another person. Watson was interviewed by the police at the time in the presence of a social worker and claimed that he had only been showing the boy how to shake himself after going to the toilet. The police kept the incident on their records, but no charges were filed. When asked what exactly happened while being questioned later in 2016, James Watson said, "I told you I don't want to talk about it. We was just 2 boys playing with each other's penises. It is as simple as that." James Watson denied being sexually attracted to children. The young boy's mother testified that she had spoken to Shirley Cliff on the night Rikki went missing. Watson's mother repeated the story her son spoke of when he claimed that a 2-year-old had been found strangled to death in the woods by the Welland Estate. But by this point, Rikki's body had not yet been found. James Watson's teacher noticed that his pupil had developed a, quote, conspicuous interest in Rikki Neave's murder. David Benjamin was the head of Walton School in Peterborough during 1994. Benjamin testified that Watson had come to school on November 30th with a copy of the local evening paper. At first, Watson made 6 photocopies of the front page, which included an article about Rikki's murder. After making a further 25 more copies to allegedly put up in the children's home where he was placed in Cambridgeshire, James Watson told David Benjamin that Rikki was his friend's brother, and he knew him well. Watson lived in a children's home between November 94 and August 95. Testifying about his time there, Jean Larkin, who had managed the home, said that a dismembered bird carcass had been found in Watson's room. During a search, she discovered magazines containing images of children and toddlers in their underwear. When asked for her thoughts on the magazines, Jean Larkin said, "I felt that there were further questions to be answered because of the type of material that was there, and on previous occasions, James had been overheard, and I believe overtly, masturbating, self-pleasuring." While at another care home, Watson began what has been described by the media as a, quote, sexual relationship with a teenage girl who was also in care. Testifying at the trial, the woman, who will be called Jane to protect her identity, said that Watson would take a knife with him when they went into the woods, where they would, quote, have sex. Jane said, when James got excited towards the end, at the end part, he would have his hands on my neck and leave marks on my throat, more than once. Jane also testified that on one occasion, Watson had killed a bird with a stone before laying it out with its wings spread and plucking out its feathers before putting it into his pocket. At the age of 15, Jane would go on to have a child fathered by James Watson. Jane spoke about how she knew that Watson was gay and still had feelings for him. She had written to him at the time, and one letter read in part, "Be straight, and I can love you." This passage was read to the court, and the defence counsel questioned Jane on whether or not her allegations about being choked were true. Jane said in response, "If you gave me 1,000,000 letters, it would not change the fact that James put his hands round my throat when we had sex and he got excited." In 2015, the case of Rikki Neave's murder was re-examined, along with the adhesive tapings taken from Rikki's clothing. A DNA profile was extracted, and that profile matched James Watson. Highlighting these findings to the court, John Price QC said, "It is the prosecution's case that the new DNA evidence, other scientific evidence, and a wealth of evidence of a variety of circumstances taken from multiple sources, which importantly are independent of one another, combine surely to prove that James Watson is indeed the killer of Rikki Neave, and the manner in which that evidence combines together cannot, it is submitted, be explained away as unfortunate coincidence." A transcript of James Watson's interview with the police from 2016 was read to the court, as the detectives involved in the investigation testified. Watson had been asked if he was responsible for Rikki's murder, and he denied that he was. He had been interviewed in 2015 and said he had just spoken to Rikki briefly before going on his way. Months later, he was interviewed again after his DNA was discovered on the tapings. In this interview, Watson slightly altered his story. Using a map to highlight his journey, he said, "I remember him just looking through a knot hole. I picked him up, chucked him over over the fence. Not chucked him over the fence, but, held him up over the fence. Watched the guys doing the work. And then we left and walked off down the second hill. These, Fatty Vowels hills that I mentioned about. We walked off here, and I carried on my route here, across through these houses." When Watson was asked how long he was with Rikki and how he picked him up, Watson replied, "Literally only minutes. I'm guessing I would have just picked him up under his armpits and lifted him up the fence. I wouldn't swear on it, that I would have just picked him up from behind under his armpits and held him up against the fence for, half a second or 30 seconds or so, while he had a look at the diggers. It was no ninja move. I don't think it was by his ear hole, if that's what you wanted to ask." James Watson explained to officers that most of what he knew about the case was from watching BBC's Crime Watch, a television programme he said he regularly viewed because he was a former criminal. Watson joked that he watched it to see if he could see his cellmates on it. As the questioning intensified, Watson grew concerned and began to simply say no comment to each question posed. The officers told him that he would be helping their investigation if he told them what he knew, and Watson responded, "I want to help you guys. I did a statement when I was 13 and again just months ago, when your colleagues came to re-interview me. And then to get arrested this morning, it just worried me slightly because, of course, I want to help you guys. Going over very old traumatic childhood memories. Difficult for me to put my mind back. Throw in the severity of I'm now a 35-year-old man sitting in a police station being questioned about a murder. It's just not your average walk in the park. I'm a bit emotionally reluctant to. A suspicion of murder? That's a very different kettle of fish." Knowing that the DNA evidence was not enough to secure a conviction, the investigators looked into James Watson's background. They tried to determine if he was telling the truth about his interaction with Rikki. Going through archival footage, the detectives discovered that there was no fence in that area at the time of Rikki's murder, disproving Watson's claim that he had innocently lifted up the 6-year-old. Also, while the case was being assessed, James Watson was in custody for another crime. In April 2018, Watson was convicted of sexual assault after he had touched another man's genitals while the victim slept. However, this was far from the first time Watson had been in trouble with the law. A year after Rikki's murder, Watson had smashed the glass of a fire alarm at Woodgate Children's Home and used a spade to damage property in the building. In 2003, he was convicted of stealing a car which he then set on fire. Watson had also stolen money and property from a nightclub where he was working. In 2005, Watson broke into a police station and took items including uniforms, equipment and the keys to an unmarked car, which he stole. In 2007, he was found to be in possession of a firearm in a public place, and the following year Watson stole money from his father, who was in hospital at the time. In September 2008, Watson broke into an empty British Transport police station, located the keys to the safe, and took a laptop, a PDA, cash, jewellery, drugs, handcuffs, batons, clothing and mace. After attempting to steal a patrol car, Watson went back into the station and used gasoline from a generator to light a fire. Watson was convicted of arson in that case, after causing over £800,000 worth of damage, which included the destruction of a substantial amount of evidence for other ongoing investigations. Claire Matthews, James Watson's then legal counsel in the arson case, said during mitigation, "He feels so let down by those charged with his care as a child. He is obsessed with authority." The judge imposed an indeterminate sentence with a minimum term of 5 years. In total, Watson had 17 convictions for theft, 5 counts of stealing a car, and further convictions for public disturbance and drug possession. After detailing their case against the defendant, the prosecution rested their case, and James Watson took the stand. James Watson told the court that he was taken into care after his father was arrested and sentenced to time in prison. Watson said he could not live with his mother because of who she lived with. He explained that he would get a taxi between the care home where he lived and his school, but he did not fit in there, so he skipped lessons often. When questioned by his barrister, Watson denied ever being abusive to animals and stated that he was actively involved in animal rights. He had even obtained a certificate from the Open University for an animal care course while in prison. Watson argued that he would not have killed a bird like his former partner had claimed, saying, "All my life I have always liked animals, and birds in particular." Watson admitted that he may have collected pheasant feathers because he found them fascinating, but when questioned about the contents of his room in the children's home, he flat out denied owning a catalogue that contained images of partially undressed children. There were 3 planks to the defence's case: that it was difficult to determine precisely when Rikki died, that there was no evidence that Watson was in the woods with Rikki, and that Rikki's body had been found in a location that had been supposedly searched on the night he went missing. The defense counsel suggested the killer may have moved Rikki's body there overnight, ruling out Watson as he was back at the children's home. Watson was asked if he had changed his story in an attempt to tailor his account to fit the DNA found, but he denied that he had. He did, however, admit that he came to learn about DNA because he had been diagnosed as being HIV positive in 2009. Watson said that the morning in question was the first and only time he had ever met Rikki Neave, and that he only spent a few minutes with him. Watson argued that a lot of the crimes that he had committed were purposefully carried out in order to be arrested. He said, "I went to a police station. That is the only place I've been where people ask, 'Are you okay? Are you all right?'" James Watson spoke about his conflicted view of the police, as he claimed his father was a serving officer before his arrest. The police had been the ones to take him into care. When asked about his sexual assault conviction, Watson said, "He was effectively sleeping beside me. During the night I reached out my hand. It landed on his stomach, and briefly, incredibly briefly, my hand touched his penis. I withdrew it straight away. The next morning, I was disgusted with myself." Watson claimed that he had only left the country after he was bailed for murder, because he was under stress and wanted to get some control back in his life. Watson testified, "My intention was always to come back and answer to my police bail." When cross-examined by the Crown Prosecutor, James Watson told John Price QC that he had only admitted to sexually assaulting a 5-year-old boy when he was 12 because he felt interrogated. Price questioned this and said, "You are trying to wriggle out of what you admitted to be true 6 years ago. Because bearing in mind the killer of Rikki Neave stripped his dead body naked and then left him posed, you want to get out of the fact the previous year you had sexually assaulted a child of exactly the same age as Rikki." Witnesses for the defence continue to testify about Ruth Neave and the abuse. According to Jennifer Dempster QC, this included the children being struck, burned with cigarettes, and being locked outside in their pyjamas. Other witnesses testified, contrary to their statements from the time, that they had seen Rikki alive in the hours after he was seen with James Watson, something the prosecution suggested were false sightings. Former police constable Robert McNeil testified that he had searched the woods on the night Rikki went missing, and said that the body was absolutely not in the location where it was found the following day. As the trial came to a close, Crown Prosecutor John Price QC summarised the case against James Watson. He told the jury, it was a sunny late autumn day, and they were going to a place both of them knew well, and both had visited many times before, at least during daylight. They were going to the woods. Sometime after the two boys arrived in the wood, from behind and without warning, James Watson ambushed Rikki Neave and strangled him to death using a ligature, whether it was the collar of the jacket Rikki was wearing or something applied on the collar. Rikki was wearing the jacket when he died, and it was still zipped up because the zip left a telltale mark on his neck. James Watson then stripped the child's body. He had an abiding sexual interest in small children, which he had already acted on in the previous year, an interest reinforced with a morbid fantasy about the death of a child known to have been on his mind as recently as 3 days earlier. Price explained to the court that as Watson attacked Rikki, one of his shirt buttons had come off. The killer had put it on a leaf nearby, before posing the boy's body just like Watson had done with a dead bird months later. The prosecution argued that Rikki's time of death could be proven to be almost exact, as the contents of his stomach showed that he had eaten Weetabix for breakfast. John Price QC said that Watson had constructed a story that he had lifted Rikki up to look through a hole in the fence to explain away DNA evidence found. Price said this statement was a, quote, really big mistake, because it never occurred to him all these years later it would be possible to conclusively prove that the high fence was not there. Jennifer Dempster QC, acting for the defence, argued in her closing statement that the jury had listened to strangers tell them half-remembered truths and cynical, deliberate, blatant lies. Dempster said that the prosecution had not proven Watson's guilt, and that there was a wealth of evidence that showed Ruth Neave could have been responsible for Rikki's death. The defence summarised the evidence from witnesses who claimed they had spotted Rikki after he was seen with Watson, and that Rikki's body had not been in the location it was found when an officer searched the area on the evening Rikki went missing. After deliberating for over 36 hours, the jury returned with a majority verdict, following a trial that lasted 11 weeks. Paul Fullwood, who had been the senior investigating officer on the case, addressed the media outside the courtroom.
The investigation team have spent hours, months and years trawling through statements, visiting witnesses and picking through every evidential opportunity to prepare for this case. We have been supported by incredible experts, witnesses and specialists who have helped us discover who was responsible. Through close working with the Crown Prosecution Service, we were able to put Watson, who was a child at the time, before the courts, and today the jury have decided he is guilty of Rikki's murder.
Speaking after the verdict was announced, Rikki's paternal aunt said that they had grieved for 27 years without closure and that Rikki's father Trevor had died, not knowing what had happened to his son, who was described as the best boy in the world. Rikki's older sister Rebecca said, "Although this day is a painful reminder of the loss we have all suffered, justice has finally been served." Speaking about the case to the Evening Standard, the Deputy Chief Crown Prosecutor for the East of England, Anna van Dadelsen, said that determining that Rikki had died within 2 hours of his last meal shifted the way the case was analysed. Soil found on Rikki's black shoes had been examined and showed that he had last walked into the woods where his body was found. This new discovery would have prevented Ruth Neave from being suspected if the technology had been available in 1994 and proved that she had not wheeled her dead son into the woods in a buggy, something that had been argued at the time. Van Dadelsen said, "The DNA evidence was absolutely crucial and really helped build our case against James Watson. Initially, Mr. Watson had denied contact with Rikki Neave and then changed his story over time to explain the contact between him and Rikki. The DNA evidence was fundamental, ensuring that James Watson had contact with Rikki Neave in the clothes that he was wearing at the point at which he died. In fact, our investigation showed that the fence didn't exist at the time that Rikki was killed. His lying was brought to the fore during the course of his cross-examination, and the jury were able to see that." After Ruth Neave had appealed to the CPS to review the case, the evidence that Rikki had died within hours of his last meal allowed them to rule out later sightings of the 6-year-old and strengthen the case against James Watson. Rikki's sisters Rochelle and Sheridan, who were toddlers at the time of his death, were later adopted after their mother was arrested for child abuse. Rochelle said that Rikki was a loving and caring older brother who looked after them, ensuring they were clean and fed despite being so young. He even resorted to taking food from the shop to make sure they ate. Rochelle told the media that because of the way the children were treated, she disliked her biological mother, saying, "Even though she didn't strangle him, she still let a 6-year-old on the streets alone and neglected him. All she was interested in was drugs and men and drink. I can't even look at her. The things that she's put us through and our poor brother. How he's been treated. How he was murdered." Rikki's other sister Sheridan said, "I think what's so tragic as well is the fact that he was just so small and so vulnerable. And he came from such a bad home. And it's just unlucky that he's come across Watson." So where are we now? Ruth Neave said in a statement following the verdict that she would like to thank the jury for making the right decision and thank those who believed in her and Rikki. However, Ruth went on to tell Cambridgeshire reporter Harry Rutter, "This is not the time to celebrate, as it should never have happened. It was the Cambridgeshire Police and Cambridgeshire Social Services working together to cover up the sexual attacks on the estate, and then framing me for my son's murder. Neglect and cruelty were used by these people to cover up their own failings. Information was gathered from liars who gave multiple statements with many different versions of their lies. Statements were released to the media, and I was not allowed to defend myself because of a gagging order from social services, so anyone could say anything and get away with it. Social services lost, destroyed and lied about my family files. But we still have many of these files, which show malicious complaints, fraud, drug taking and forged documents, all from social services. Now my son's murderer is convicted and the police and social services have totally ruined mine and my daughter's lives. The only thing now is to close this chapter in my life and open a new one. I wonder what Rikki would be like today. Married, children, who knows? But this monster has taken that all from me and my daughters." James Watson's sentencing hearing was held on June 24, 2022. In her victim personal statement, Rikki's eldest sister addressed Watson and said, "After all these years of living your life, you finally get your comeuppance, and Rikki finally gets justice." Rikki's younger sister Rochelle, who was 3 when he was murdered, also offered a statement saying, "After I entered the care system, I suffered severe mental health issues. I remember Rikki feeding me, washing me, and helping me with my clothes. He has missed so much of our lives, happy times that we have had. I also wonder what he would be like if he was still here, but sadly I will never know because he was taken from me." Ruth Neave, who had been tried and acquitted of her son's murder in 1996, was not present at the hearing, but her victim personal statement was read to the court. Ruth said that Rikki was the most beautiful person ever. She missed all of his cheekiness and laughter. She admitted hitting him, something she had been convicted of after his murder. The statement by Ruth Neave read in part, "My Rikki was a little firecracker. I could not have wished for a better son. He was adorable. I love you with all my heart and soul. He was my soulmate. I had my children snatched out of my arms in the middle of the night because the police were so adamant that I had killed Rikki and would then kill my daughters. I feel dead inside. He was the only son I had. Rikki's murder left a massive hole in our lives and in our hearts. I miss him so much that it feels like I have had my heart ripped out." Presiding Judge Mrs. Justice McGowan summarised the case in her sentencing remarks. She described Rikki as a child who was born into a difficult home and was on the at-risk register for a period prior to his murder. The judge said that Rikki would avoid school during the day aside from lunchtime, where it was the only place he was guaranteed to get a proper meal. Rikki Neave's short life was marred by neglect and at times physical abuse before he ever met his killer. Mrs. Justice McGowan concluded that she believed James Watson had been harbouring a sexual interest in little boys from a young age, and evidence supporting this belief had been presented at the trial. The judge did not find that Watson had sexually assaulted Rikki prior to his murder, but she did say that the, quote, bizarre stripping and positioning of the body was undoubtedly done as a manifestation of that sexual interest, but it does not amount to concealment or desecration. As Watson was 13 at the time the crime was committed, the judge was obligated to sentence him in accordance with the legislation regarding youth offenders. The minimum sentence for a juvenile convicted of murder is 12 years, but Mrs. Justice McGowan highlighted several aggravating factors that she had considered. These were that a vulnerable child who had a troubled family life and was willing to trust strangers was murdered by another child who was significantly older and stronger. The judge also believed that the murder was premeditated. She said, Rikki Neave was not necessarily the intended victim, but James Watson had premeditated and spoken about killing some young boy in precisely the same way and place as Rikki was killed. Mrs. Justice McGowan reviewed mitigating factors such as Watson's age at the time and his own difficult upbringing. Watson's barrister Jennifer Dempster QC had told the judge the defendant himself was a victim at the hands of others. The defendant's education and general childhood was affected by being let down by a variety of adults in his life who ought not to have done so. This was a young man, a young boy, who really had no stability in life. After considering all of the evidence and testimony, the judge concluded, the sentence I would be bound to pass today if he was still a teenager would have a minimum term of at least 18 years, adjusting that to reflect what would have happened at the time of the offence and his comparatively young age. The sentence I impose is detention for life at Her Majesty's pleasure, and I set the minimum term at 15 years, less 843 days.
In court, the judge said James Watson's sentence reflected the fact that he was a child when he killed Rikki Neave, a 6-year-old boy, she said, who never had the chance to be happy and lead a fulfilling life, an opportunity denied to him by his killer.
Today's sentencing marks the final chapter in our journey to secure justice for Rikki and his family. It has taken a significant period of time to get to this point, but we made a promise that we would find the person responsible for Rikki's death, and it's a promise that we've kept. For years, Watson had hidden away, knowing he was responsible for Rikki's murder and thinking he'd gotten away with it. But this is no longer the case. He will spend years behind bars, and the truth is finally out.
James Watson had already spent over 2 years in custody between the day he was charged with murder and the day he was sentenced for the crime. The amount of time served would be deducted from the sentence imposed. James Watson is eligible to apply for parole in 2035. Thank you for listening, and special thanks to our Patreon supporters. For more information on this episode, please see the show notes or visit our website, theywalkamonguspodcast.com.